Hi dears, we shall learn linguistics, English language, history and contemporary linguistics, and in that module 3 syntax. Syntax begins with the concept of traditional grammar, which is a very vague concept. David Crystal, the famous linguist, has pointed out that there is no such thing as a single homogeneous traditional approach to grammar. There never was any one traditional grammar which enshrined all the fallacies which structuralists condemn. There were different grammars. Scholars like Ben Jonson, who wrote the earliest English grammars, were men deeply learned in Latin and Greek. So, they took Latin grammar as the norm and analyzed English in terms of Latin. So, the rules of the traditional English grammars are mainly an inheritance from the Latin based grammar of the 18th century. They tried to fit English grammar in the framework of Latin grammar. They forgot that Latin is Latin and English is English and tried to fit English grammar in the framework of Latin grammar. So, that was the mistake. They analyzed English in terms of Latin. They forgot the fact that Latin and English are two different languages. What is grammar? The origin of the word grammar is found in the Greek word. First definition of grammar we can make like this. Grammar is a science of structure and uses of language. It is the science of structure and uses of language. Another definition for grammar is this. Grammar is the rules of language behavior. The grammar which describes a language on the model of Latin grammar is known as the traditional grammar. So if you want a definition for traditional grammar, we can use this definition. The grammar which describes a language on the model of Latin grammar, Latin language, is known as the traditional grammar. The grammarian who describes a language on the model of Latin grammar is known as traditionalist. So in the context of linguistics, who is known as a traditionalist? The grammarian who describes a language on the model of Latin grammar is known as traditionalist. Traditional grammar describes a language on the model of Latin grammar. Traditional grammarians use the framework of Latin grammar in the description of another language. Traditional said that spoken form of languages does not need to have a grammar and only written forms of languages needs to have grammar. So the traditionalists, the traditional grammarians completely avoided the spoken form. They formulated rules for the written form of language only. But this thinking was opposed by structural grammarians or structuralists because according to them there are some languages in the world which doesn't have written form. So there are languages in the world with spoken form only. These languages do not have grammar also. In the early decades of the 20th century, the weaknesses of the traditional grammar were realized. It became necessary for some anthropologists to see language in a new perspective. They proposed some radically different methods of studying language behavior. The second landmark of language study is known as structural grammar or structural approach to grammar. In the second half of the 20th century, an American linguist, Noam Chomsky, was responsible for yet another landmark in the language study. His vision of language behavior is revolutionary. His approach to language study is known as transformational grammar. These new approaches to language study put forth the drawbacks of traditional grammar. So our module syntax can be divided into three parts for our convenience. The first part is the traditional grammar, the traditionalists, where they formulated the rules of grammar, the rules of English grammar based on Latin grammar. They focused only on the written form of language and they were very adamant about the norms and rules of grammar. Then, at the beginning of 20th century, a set of linguists and grammarians, they have discovered the incompetencies and incongruencies in traditional grammar, and they formulated a new approach to grammar which is known as structural grammar or structural approach to grammar. They focused on the spoken form of language, they focused on the languages without written form, and they focused more on the structure of the sentences. They are known as the structuralists. And from structuralism, there emerged transformational grammar, which was put forth by the American linguist Noam Chomsky. Transformational generative grammar or transformational grammar is a leap in the study of linguistics. We shall learn it towards the end of this module. In the 1930s and 1940s, there was a great outcry against the traditional grammar or the traditional approach to grammar in Europe and America. This was a period when the structuralism was fast developing as a scientific discipline. The structuralists strongly reacted against the thinking of the traditional grammarians. The structuralists named these weaknesses of traditional grammar as fallacies of traditional grammar. These are as follows. So when structuralism as a school of linguistics, school of language emerged in America and Europe, they pointed out several drawbacks of the traditional approach to grammar, and they called these drawbacks as fallacies of traditional grammar. We shall see which are the fallacies or errors. What is the meaning of fallacy? Fallacy means errors. What are the errors in the traditional grammar? The first one is Latinate fallacy. The first defect of traditional grammar, according to structuralists, is the use of one language framework in the description of another language. It is said that most of the traditional grammarians who wrote an English grammar were trained in Latin grammar. So, they used the framework of Latin grammar, Latin language in the description of English language. But according to the structuralists, English language and Latin language have different structures and frameworks. Hence, we cannot use the Latin framework system to examine English language system. It would be like using the Sanskrit framework to describe German language. So, entirely different languages. We know Latin is an inflectional language with inflections, but English is not like that. So, using the framework of Latin in English would be troublesome. What the structuralists try to say is that it is wrong to impose one language framework in the description of another language. Each language has unique sense and unique grammar. Logical fallacy. This is the second weakness of the traditional approach to language. This is called the logical fallacy. Traditional grammarians assume that the laws of logic and principles of grammar are the same. According to the structuralists, laws of language are not logical. So, it is the error of analyzing the laws of logic and principles of grammar on equal parlance, or comparing the laws of logic and the principles of grammar equally. But we know, or the structuralists said, that they are two different arenas. The traditionalists had a false faith in the existence of laws universally applicable to all languages. But structuralists said that each language has its own system of rules, and it is absurd to expect all languages to behave alike. So that is logical fallacy. The traditionalists believed that by the logic of understanding one language, or the logic of understanding the grammar of one language, we can analyze or learn and predict all languages, because the traditionalists believe that all the languages in the world have some common logic and rules. So the structuralists discovered that there is no universal laws, or there are no laws which are applicable to all the languages universally. So that is logical fallacy. Third one is semantic fallacy. What is semantics? Yeah, study of meaning is semantics. Semantic fallacy. Structuralists pointed out that many of the traditional grammar categories were based on meaning. They called it as semantic fallacy. Semantic fallacy means the use of meaning in the definition of grammatical categories. Structuralists said that meaning cannot be studied scientifically because it is not verifiable. Meaning, according to them, is a matter of introspection, therefore, it is beyond the scope of scientific investigation. Examples of this kind of fallacies are as follows. A noun is the name of a person, place, or thing. An interrogative is a sentence that asks a question. So, there we categorized a noun or a word based on its meaning. We categorized a sentence as an interrogative sentence by this definition is a sentence that asks a question. Structuralists objected the use of meaning as a tool in grammatical analysis. Another problem with the meaning-based definitions according to structuralists is that these definitions give scope to subjective interpretation and it cannot be used with precision. To explain it in some detail, the sentence, would you pass the salt? Would you pass the salt? According to the definition, it is an interrogative sentence. An interrogative sentence is a sentence that asks a question. But here it is not a question but a request. And another question, you are ready for the test? You are ready for the test? It is a question but not an interrogative sentence. It is a declarative sentence. It is a statement. You are ready for the test? We have made the sentence into a question by rising intonation at the end of the sentence. You are ready for the test? So it is a statement, not a question. So dividing a sentence, a structure, or a word based on its meaning or categorizing it on the basis of definition or meaning is an error. Fourth one is prescriptive fallacy. Traditional grammar tended to be prescriptive. Structuralists pointed out that grammar of any language must be scientific and descriptive. While a descriptive grammarian describes the rules elicited from the actual use of language by native speakers, a prescriptive grammarian very often prescribes rules and norms. So, what is the difference between prescriptive grammar and descriptive grammar? Yeah, descriptive grammar describes the rules elicited from the actual use of language by native speakers. It is from the practical use of a language they describe the grammar. But in the case of prescriptive grammar, they set out a certain rules at the beginning and the native speakers are compelled to follow these prescriptive rules. This would hamper the use of language. So a grammar of a language should be descriptive, says structuralists. Fifth fallacy is mixing of different criteria. Some of the traditional grammar's definitions are based on meaning, some on function and some are on form. Noun and verb are defined on semantic basis, but an adjective is defined as a word that modifies a noun, a definition based on function. So, in traditional grammar, the categories of words are defined some on semantic basis and some on the basis of its function, etc. For example, what is a noun? Noun is a naming word. What is a verb? Verb is an action word. It is based on its semantic basis. What is an adjective? Adjective is a word that qualifies or modifies a noun. That category is defined on the basis of its function. Okay. According to structuralists, it is unscientific to mix up different criteria in defining one language system. Structuralists preferred on consistent set of criteria for defining language system. Sixth fallacy is lack of explicitness. Explicit statements are those which are clearly and unambiguously stated. Traditional grammars lacked explicitness with regard to linguistic descriptions. Structuralists made explicit statements which could be easily tested and proved. So the traditional grammarians were not able to describe the linguistic descriptions. Why this is so? Why this word has followed another word? So traditional grammar was not able to describe correctly and unambiguously the usages and the structure of a sentence. But the structuralists say that a language should be explicit. It should unambiguously and clearly state all the combinations of words and phrases to form a sentence. There should be explicitness in the description of statements. Seventh fallacy is written form fallacy or neglect of the spoken form. Traditional grammarians ignored the spoken form of the language and wrote grammar based on the written form. Structuralists name these drawbacks as a written form fallacy. So we have seen it earlier. Traditional grammarians focused only on the written form of language. Traditionalists neglected the phonology. They concentrated on syntax and morphology. But according to structuralists, spoken form of language is the only important thing to be studied. They stressed on the primacy of speech, primacy of the spoken word. Spoken word is the first utterance, or spoken form is at the first, written comes after the spoken form. So importance should be given to the spoken form. When the traditionalists focused only on morphology and syntax, traditionalists argued the importance of focusing on phonology also. Phonology, spoken form, focusing on the spoken form. Eighth fallacy is ignoring language variation. Traditionalists believe that only the language of great literature is worth paying attention to. Traditionalists neglected the other variations such as informal language, formal language, market language. They ignored the synchronic variations of dialect, register, etc. Traditional grammarians were not interested in these types of languages, so the traditional grammar is incomplete. The scientific structuralist approach takes all the varieties into consideration and objectively describes them. So it is an error of taking only one variety of language under scrutiny and describing or prescribing rules of grammar based on that variety only. So we know there are different types of Malayalam, different varieties of Malayalam. Basing or studying grammar based only on the written form of standard form of Malayalam is not a complete grammar. A grammar should include all the variations of languages like formal language, informal language, market language, register, dialect, pidgin, creole, everything should be taken for scrutiny. The last fallacy is historical fallacy. The traditionalists ignored linguistic changes and considered them as a corrupting influence on language and tried to preserve its purity within quotes. They looked upon the language of past masters as model for present day English. Written language tends to preserve outdated words and usages. Since language is subject to change, the grammarian should be describing contemporary usage. We know language is in a constant flux. It is always changing. It is not static. So there is no such so-called purity for language. Language evolves, language changes, language adds and deletes words and phrases to it and from it. So there is no such purity and there is no such task of preserving language's purity. But the traditionalists, focusing on the Latin language and Latin grammar tried to preserve the purity of language without minding the changes, the contemporary changes that are happening to English language. So that is known as historical fallacies. Fallacy. So these are the important fallacies of traditional grammar. Because of by pointing out these fallacies, a set of linguists towards the beginning and middle of the 20th century evolved with a new set of grammar, rules of grammar, which is known as the structural grammar, structural linguistics. Thank you.